She can't even afford the appetizer, Marcus laughed, his voice cutting through the elegant atmosphere of Bella Vista like a knife through butter. His eyes swept over my thrift store cardigan and worn jeans with obvious disdain. Emma, maybe you should just stick to the breadbasket tonight. The entire table went silent, except for Jessica's stifled giggle behind her wineglass. I forced a smile and nodded, my fingers tightening around the cloth napkin in my lap as the familiar burn of humiliation spread through my chest. Around us, the soft jazz music and clinking of expensive silverware continued, but all I could hear was the echo of my brother's words bouncing off the restaurant's marble walls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Emma Collins, 29 years old, sitting in one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, while my family treated me like I was some charity case they'd reluctantly dragged along. To them, I was the struggling sister who barely scraped by writing food blogs that nobody read, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment in southeast Portland. They saw my secondhand clothes, my decade-old Honda Civic with the dented bumper, and my reluctance to join their expensive outings, and they drew their conclusions. What they didn't know could fill entire boardrooms. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, had always been the golden child. At 32, he worked in tech sales, pulling in a comfortable $120,000 a year, which he never let anyone forget. His wife Jessica was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury homes, and together they lived in a sprawling house in West Hills, with a view that cost more than most people's annual salary. They drove matching BMWs and took quarterly trips to wine country, documenting every moment on social media with hashtags about blessed life and hard work paying off. Our mother Patricia had retired from her banking career 2 years earlier, and she'd moved to a senior community in Beaverton, where she spent her days playing bridge and bragging about Marcus's achievements to anyone who would listen. She'd worked hard her whole life to provide for us after our father left when I was 12, but somewhere along the way, she'd decided that success could only be measured in visible wealth and traditional career paths. My food writing didn't fit her definition of accomplishment. The irony was suffocating. While Marcus boasted about his 6-figure salary and Jessica flashed her designer handbags, I was quietly running a restaurant empire that generated more revenue in a month than they made in a year. Harvest and Hearth wasn't just any restaurant chain, it was 12 carefully curated locations across the Pacific Northwest, each one specializing in farm-to-table cuisine that had earned critical acclaim and a fiercely loyal customer base. The flagship location in Portland's Pearl District had a 3-week waiting list for weekend reservations. I'd started the business 5 years earlier with a single food truck and a dream of bringing authentic, locally sourced meals to busy professionals. The truck had been a testing ground, a way to perfect recipes and understand what customers really wanted without the overhead of a traditional restaurant. Within 18 months, I'd saved enough to lease a small space in a developing neighborhood, and Harvest and Hearth was born. The concept was simple but executed flawlessly: fresh, seasonal ingredients prepared by talented chefs in an atmosphere that felt both sophisticated and welcoming. The growth had been methodical and deliberate. Instead of rushing to expand, I'd focused on perfecting the model, building strong relationships with local farms and suppliers, and training a management team that could maintain quality across multiple locations. By year 3, I had 4 restaurants. By year 5, 12 locations from Seattle to Eugene, with plans for expansion into California. The annual revenue had hit $15 million last year, and we were on track to exceed $20 million this year. But nobody in my family knew any of this. To maintain my cover, I'd hired experienced general managers for each location and stayed completely behind the scenes. My business partner Tyler Bennett handled most of the public-facing aspects of the company, appearing at industry events and giving interviews to food magazines. To anyone looking from the outside, I was just a freelance food blogger who occasionally consulted for restaurants on menu development. The modest apartment I rented was real, as was the aging Honda Civic, but they were choices, not necessities. I could have afforded a mansion in the hills and a garage full of luxury cars, but staying under the radar had become essential to my strategy. The strategy wasn't just about business, it was about protection. Growing up, I'd watched how differently Marcus and I were treated based on perceived success. When he landed his first sales job, the family celebration lasted for weeks. When I started writing about food, the response was polite disappointment masked as concern for my financial future. I'd learned early that in my family your worth was directly tied to your bank balance and your job title, and I wasn't interested in playing that game. So I'd built my empire in secret, carefully constructing a double life that allowed me to pursue my passion without the weight of family expectations or the risk of being treated differently because of my wealth. The food blog was real. I did write reviews and industry analyses, but it was more of a hobby than a primary income source. The consulting work was also legitimate, though it was usually for my own restaurants under various business arrangements that kept my ownership hidden. The monthly family dinners had become a theater of sorts, a place where I played the role of the struggling younger sister, while observing the dynamics that had shaped our relationships for years. Marcus would order the most expensive items on the menu and make a show of paying the bill, while Jessica would offer unsolicited advice about budgeting and career planning. Patricia would sigh about how worried she was about my future, wondering aloud when I'd find a nice man with a stable job to take care of me. Tonight was no different, except for the particular cruelty in Marcus's voice when he'd made his comment about the appetizer. We were celebrating his latest promotion to regional sales manager, and the smugness radiating from his side of the table was almost unbearable. Jessica had spent the first 20 minutes of dinner describing their upcoming vacation to Tuscany, making sure to mention the cost of their villa rental and the Michelin-starred restaurants they planned to visit. Patricia had beamed with pride as Marcus described his new responsibilities and the company car that came with his position. When the conversation finally turned to me, the energy shifted dramatically. "And how's the writing going, Emma?" Patricia asked with the tone reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. "Are you getting enough work to pay your bills?" I'd given my usual response about steady clients and interesting projects, but Marcus had clearly been waiting for an opening to assert his superiority. The comment about the appetizer was just the beginning. Throughout the evening, he'd made increasingly pointed remarks about my lifestyle choices, my career prospects, and my apparent inability to afford the finer things in life. What Marcus didn't realize was that I could have bought Bella Vista outright with the cash reserves sitting in my business accounts. What Jessica didn't know was that the handbag she'd been flaunting cost less than what I made in a single day from my restaurant operations. What Patricia couldn't understand was that I'd already achieved more financial success than Marcus would likely see in his entire career, and I'd done it by following my passion instead of chasing someone else's definition of stability.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The breadbasket comment had been the final straw, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it crystallized everything wrong with the dynamic we'd fallen into over the years. Marcus genuinely believed he was superior to me based solely on the superficial markers of success he could see. He had no curiosity about my actual life, no interest in understanding what I did or why I chose to live the way I did. To him, I was a failure who needed his charity and his condescension. But the game was about to change. Sitting in that restaurant, surrounded by the family who'd dismissed me for years, I made a decision that would alter everything. I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of watching them congratulate themselves for achievements that paled in comparison to what I'd built in secret. The empire I'd constructed from nothing was about to step out of the shadows, and my family was going to learn exactly who Emma Collins really was. The evening continued with its familiar rhythm of subtle insults and backhanded concern, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. Every condescending comment, every pitying look, every assumption about my limited prospects was being catalogued and stored away. They thought they knew me, thought they understood my story, thought they could predict my future. They had no idea that the quiet woman in the thrift store cardigan controlled more restaurants than they'd eaten at in their entire lives combined. As Marcus signed the check with his usual flourish, making sure everyone noticed the generous tip he was leaving, I smiled genuinely for the first time all evening. Tomorrow would bring interesting developments, and my family's comfortable assumptions about Emma Collins were about to be challenged in ways they never saw coming. The underestimated sister was about to remind them that success comes in many forms, and the most powerful victories often belong to those who've been overlooked for far too long. The morning after that humiliating dinner, I sat in my modest Southeast Portland apartment, staring at my laptop screen, while sipping coffee from a chipped mug that Marcus would probably use as evidence of my financial struggles. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was reviewing quarterly reports showing a 43% increase in revenue across all Harvest and Hearth locations, while surrounded by the carefully curated appearance of barely making ends meet. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, and I already knew what it would contain before opening it. "Hope you enjoyed last night. Marcus and I were talking, and we think you might benefit from meeting with our financial advisor. She helps people create budgets and find ways to save money. No judgment, just practical help. Let me know." The message was followed by 3 heart emojis, as if that would soften the condescension dripping from every word. I set the phone aside and returned to the real business of my morning. Tyler Bennett, my business partner and the public face of Harvest and Hearth, had scheduled a video call to discuss our expansion plans for the Sacramento market. Tyler was one of only 3 people who knew the true extent of my involvement in the company. To the industry, he was the visionary founder who'd built something special from the ground up. To our employees, I was simply Emma, the mysterious consultant who occasionally provided menu development expertise and strategic guidance. Tyler's face appeared on my screen, his usual enthusiasm evident even through the pixelated connection. "Emma, the Sacramento numbers are incredible. The demographic analysis shows we could support 3 locations within the first 2 years, and the real estate team has identified perfect spots in Midtown East Sacramento and near UC Davis." We spent the next hour diving into market penetration strategies, supplier relationships, and staffing projections. The conversation was the kind Marcus imagined himself having in his tech sales role, but with stakes and complexity that would probably give him a headache. We were discussing opening 3 new restaurants simultaneously, a $20 million investment that would create nearly 200 jobs and establish Harvest and Hearth as a major player in the California market. "The California expansion is going to require more capital than we've deployed before," Tyler noted, scrolling through spreadsheets that showed cash flow projections extending 2 years into the future. "Are you comfortable committing this much liquidity to a single market?" I smiled, thinking about Marcus's proud announcement of his $10,000 annual bonus the night before. "Tyler, we have the reserves, and the market research supports the investment. The Sacramento Test Kitchen has been developing regional adaptations for 6 months, and our supply chain partners have confirmed they can scale to meet demand. This isn't risky expansion, it's strategic growth." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from hiring timelines to marketing budgets. By the time we ended the call, we'd committed to the largest expansion in company history, a decision that would generate more annual revenue than most small cities. I closed the laptop and returned to the persona that kept my secret safe, changing into worn jeans and a faded sweater before heading out to maintain my cover story. My afternoon was spent at Powell's Books, research that looked like casual browsing but was actually market analysis for potential Portland expansion. The Pearl District location was consistently booked solid, and I'd been considering opening a second Portland restaurant in a different neighborhood with a slightly different concept. Powell's attracted exactly the demographic I was targeting, educated professionals with disposable income who valued quality over quantity. I settled into a corner table at the Powell's Cafe with a notebook and a cup of coffee that cost more than my entire outfit appeared to be worth. Around me, conversations flowed between writers, artists, tech workers, and university professors, exactly the mix of customers who'd made our Pearl District location so successful. I sketched out ideas for a smaller, more intimate concept that could work in a neighborhood like Hawthorne or Alberta, something that felt more like a neighborhood gathering place than a destination restaurant. My phone buzzed with another family text, this time from Patricia. "Emma, honey, I've been thinking about what Marcus said last night. Have you considered taking some business courses at the community college? They have programs that could help you transition into a more stable career. I could help with the tuition if money is tight." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel but because it was so completely disconnected from reality. Patricia was offering to help pay for business courses while I sat planning an expansion that would require more business acumen than most MBA programs could teach. She genuinely believed I needed basic education in concepts I'd been successfully implementing for years. I typed back a simple, "Thanks for thinking of me, I'll consider it," and returned to my planning. The fictional version of Emma Collins would be grateful for her mother's concern and practical suggestions. The real Emma Collins was calculating profit margins and evaluating whether the Alberta Arts District could support a restaurant with a $40 average check per person. My cover story had roots in truth, which made it easier to maintain consistently. I did write food blogs, and they were well researched and insightful enough to maintain credibility in the industry. The consulting work was legitimate, though my clients had no idea they were working with the owner of their biggest regional competitor. The modest lifestyle was a choice rather than a necessity, but the apartment and the car were real, and I genuinely enjoyed the simplicity they represented. The blog had started as a way to understand the market from a customer perspective, but it had evolved into something more personal. Writing about food culture, restaurant trends, and the intersection of local agriculture with urban dining gave me insights that pure business analysis couldn't provide. The consultation work kept me connected to other restaurateurs' challenges and strategies, information that proved invaluable when making decisions about Harvest and Hearth's direction. But maintaining the double life required constant vigilance. Every interaction with family involved careful attention to details that might contradict my supposed financial situation. I'd memorized the prices of basic groceries so I could complain about inflation convincingly. I'd researched budget airlines and discount shopping strategies so I could participate in conversations about saving money. I'd even created a fake freelance income in my head, complete with imaginary clients and realistic payment schedules. The psychological toll was becoming harder to ignore. Sitting in family gatherings while they discussed their financial achievements felt like wearing an elaborate costume that grew heavier with each performance. Marcus's condescension was irritating, but Patricia's genuine worry was almost worse. She spent sleepless nights concerned about my future, creating elaborate backup plans for a crisis that existed only in her imagination. Jessica's suggestion about the financial advisor was particularly galling because it came from a place of assumed superiority. She genuinely believed she was helping someone less fortunate, offering charity to a family member who couldn't manage her own affairs. The irony that my net worth exceeded theirs by several $1,000,000 was lost in the performance I'd committed to maintaining. That evening I drove my dented Honda to the Pearl District and parked 3 blocks away from the flagship Harvest and Hearth location. The evening rush was in full swing, and through the large windows, I could see every table occupied. The host's stand had a small crowd waiting despite the reservation system, and servers moved efficiently between tables with plates that represented months of menu development and testing. I watched my empire operate without me, a strange feeling that combined pride with melancholy. The restaurant represented everything I'd worked to achieve, but it also symbolized the distance I'd created between my authentic self and my family relationships. The success felt hollow when it couldn't be shared with the people who mattered most, even if their reaction would probably disappoint me. From my car, I could see into the kitchen through the service window, where head chef Maria Santos was orchestrating the dinner service with military precision. Maria was another person who knew my true role in the company, and watching her work reminded me why the secrecy had been worth maintaining. The food emerging from that kitchen was exactly what I'd envisioned when I started with a single food truck, elevated comfort food that honored both innovation and tradition. My phone rang, and Tyler's name appeared on the screen. Emma, I just left the Pearl District location, and Maria wanted me to tell you that the new autumn menu is testing incredibly well. The butternut squash risotto with hazelnuts is already becoming a signature dish, and the braised short ribs with root vegetables are outselling everything else in the entree category. That's fantastic news, I replied, watching late arrivals being seated at the bar. Maria's instincts about seasonal adaptation have been perfect. How are the profit margins looking with the new supplier contracts? Better than projected. The direct relationships with local farms are keeping costs stable despite increased demand, and the premium pricing is being accepted without resistance. We're looking at a 12% increase in per-table revenue compared to last quarter. The conversation was the highlight of my day, a chance to discuss the real work that occupied my thoughts and energy. Tyler understood the complexity of what we'd built together, the hundreds of decisions and countless hours that had transformed a simple idea into a thriving business. With him, I didn't have to pretend or perform or diminish my achievements to make others comfortable. After ending the call, I remained parked outside my own restaurant, watching customers enjoy meals that existed because of vision and work they'd never associate with the struggling food blogger from the family dinner stories. The disconnect between perception and reality had become a defining feature of my life, and sitting there in the darkness, I wondered how much longer I could maintain the charade. The decision to reveal the truth was forming slowly, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Marcus's comment about the breadbasket had been a catalyst, but the real motivation ran deeper. I was tired of being invisible in my own success story, tired of watching my family pity me for problems I didn't have while celebrating achievements that paled in comparison to what I'd accomplished. But revealing the truth would require more than simply announcing my ownership of Harvest and Hearth. The years of deception would need explanation, and my family's reaction was impossible to predict. They might feel deceived or manipulated, hurt that I'd hidden such a significant part of my life from them. They might question why I'd allowed them to worry about my financial security while I was building a multi-million-dollar company. The complexity of the situation was daunting, but the alternative was becoming unbearable. Every family gathering required more elaborate pretense, more careful attention to maintaining a fiction that served no one's interests. The success I'd worked so hard to achieve felt meaningless when it couldn't be acknowledged or celebrated with the people who'd shaped my life. As I drove home through Portland's quiet streets, I made a preliminary decision that would change everything. The revelation wouldn't happen immediately, but it would happen. My family was going to learn who Emma Collins really was, and the carefully constructed assumptions about my life were about to crumble. The only question was how to orchestrate the disclosure in a way that maximized impact while minimizing collateral damage. The apartment felt smaller when I returned, as if the evening's contemplation had highlighted the artificial limitations I'd imposed on my own life. The chipped coffee mug and second-hand furniture weren't charming signs of humble living anymore, they were props in a performance that was becoming increasingly exhausting to maintain. I opened my laptop and began researching something that had nothing to do with restaurants or business expansion. Instead, I started looking into private investigation services, specifically firms that specialized in financial background checks and asset verification. If my family wanted to make assumptions about my financial situation, perhaps it was time to provide them with some concrete data to consider. The plan forming in my mind was ambitious and slightly vindictive, but it felt proportionate to years of condescension and dismissal. Marcus had built his identity around being the successful sibling, the one who'd figured out how to navigate the professional world while his sister struggled with unstable creative work. Jessica derived satisfaction from offering financial advice to someone she perceived as less capable. Patricia worried constantly about a daughter whose future appeared uncertain and precarious. All of those assumptions were about to be tested in ways they never anticipated. The struggling food blogger was about to remind her family that success comes in many forms, and the most impressive achievements often belong to those who work quietly while others make noise about smaller accomplishments. The revolution was beginning, and Emma Collins was ready to step out of the shadows. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting across from Detective Rebecca Morgan at a small cafe in Northwest Portland, watching her flip through a manila folder that contained more information about my life than my own family possessed. Rebecca wasn't actually a detective anymore. She'd transitioned into private investigation work 2 years earlier, specializing in corporate fraud and asset verification for divorce attorneys and insurance companies. Her reputation for thoroughness had made her my first choice when I decided to commission a comprehensive background check on myself. "This is fascinating work, Emma," Rebecca said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the financial documents her team had compiled. "In 20 years of investigation, I've never had someone hire me to investigate themselves, but I have to admit, the results are remarkable. Your family has no idea what you've accomplished." The folder contained bank statements, tax returns, business registration documents, and property records that painted a complete picture of my financial empire. Rebecca's team had approached the investigation as if they were preparing for a contentious divorce case, assembling the kind of documentation that would hold up in court. Every asset, every revenue stream, every business relationship had been verified and cross-referenced. "The Harvest and Hearth ownership structure is particularly clever," Rebecca continued, pointing to a diagram that showed the complex web of limited liability companies and partnerships I'd used to maintain anonymity. "Most people trying to hide assets do it to avoid taxes or legal obligations, but you've created this structure purely for privacy. It's actually quite admirable." I sipped my coffee and reviewed the executive summary one more time. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Total net worth, $18.7 million. Annual income from restaurant operations, $12.2 million. Property holdings, 4 commercial buildings and 2 residential properties. Investment portfolio, diversified across technology stocks, municipal bonds, and real estate investment trusts. The woman my family pitied for her inability to afford dinner appetizers was worth more than all of them combined. "The beauty of this documentation," Rebecca explained, "is that it's completely objective. These aren't estimates or projections, they're verified facts pulled from official records. Your brother's tech salary is impressive until you realize you make more in 6 weeks than he makes in a year. Your sister-in-law's real estate commissions are negligible compared to the property appreciation on your commercial holdings." The investigation had revealed details even I hadn't fully appreciated. My Pearl District restaurant building had increased in value by 40% since I'd purchased it 3 years earlier. The intellectual property rights to my standardized recipes and operational procedures were valued at over $2 million. The brand recognition and customer loyalty metrics showed Harvest and Hearth competing successfully with restaurant chains that had been operating for decades. "What's your timeline for disclosure?" Rebecca asked, closing the folder and leaning back in her chair. "Because this kind of revelation is going to fundamentally alter your family dynamics. People don't recover quickly from discovering they've been completely wrong about someone for years." That was the question that had been keeping me awake at night. The documentation gave me the ammunition I needed to correct my family's assumptions, but it didn't resolve the emotional complexity of the situation. Years of hiding had created a relationship dynamic based on false pretenses, and revealing truth would force everyone to confront how they'd treated me based on incomplete information. "I think the disclosure needs to happen naturally," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced of my own strategy. Creating a dramatic confrontation might feel satisfying in the moment, but it could damage relationships permanently. I need them to discover the truth in a way that makes them question their assumptions rather than just defending their previous behavior. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, people handle surprising information better when they discover it themselves rather than having it forced on them. But you also need to consider that they might feel deceived or manipulated when they realize how long you've been hiding this from them." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Marcus. "Family dinner Sunday at Mom's place. She's making her famous pot roast. Hope you can afford to bring dessert this time." The message was followed by a laughing emoji, as if his joke about my financial limitations was particularly clever. I showed Rebecca the text, and she shook her head with obvious disgust. Your brother has no idea how close he is to learning a very humbling lesson about assumptions and success. The timing felt significant. Sunday dinner at Patricia's house was always an intimate affair, just the core family gathered around her small dining table in the senior community. The setting would be perfect for a subtle revelation, assuming I could orchestrate the disclosure without creating unnecessary drama. I had 4 days to plan an approach that would be educational rather than punitive. Rebecca, I want to hire your services for one more project, I said, an idea forming as I spoke. I need you to prepare a business valuation report for Harvest and Hearth, something that could plausibly be requested by a potential investor or acquisition target. Make it comprehensive and professional, the kind of document that would be generated during due diligence for a major transaction. Her eyes lit up with understanding. You want them to accidentally discover the information rather than having it presented directly. That's actually brilliant. A legitimate business document feels less like a personal attack and more like an objective revelation. We spent the next hour outlining the scope of the valuation report. It would include everything: detailed financial statements, market analysis, competitive positioning, growth projections, and executive compensation data. The document would be thick enough to feel important and official enough to be credible. Most importantly, it would contain my name in multiple contexts that made my ownership and leadership role impossible to deny. I'll need 3 business days to compile everything, Rebecca said, making notes in her planner. But I can deliver a report that would satisfy any investment banker or corporate attorney. When your family sees this document, they'll understand exactly what you've built and exactly how much they've underestimated you. The meeting ended with me writing a check for Rebecca's services, another irony that would have amused Marcus if he'd known about it. I was paying more for a background check than he'd earned in bonuses last year, using pocket change from a business empire he couldn't imagine me creating. The drive home took me past the Hawthorne location I'd been considering for expansion, a corner building with large windows and foot traffic that reminded me of the early days when every decision felt monumentally important. Now choosing restaurant locations was routine business planning, but the thrill of building something from nothing hadn't completely faded. My phone rang as I parked outside my apartment, and Tyler's name appeared on the screen. Emma, I just got off a call with the Sacramento real estate team, and they've found something incredible. There's a historic building in Midtown that's perfect for our flagship California location, but the lease negotiation is complex. We need to move quickly if we want to secure it. What kind of complexity? I asked, settling into my car seat for what I knew would be a detailed conversation about commercial real estate. The building owner wants a 10-year lease with significant upfront investment in historical restoration, but they're also offering equity participation if we meet certain revenue benchmarks. It's the kind of deal that could be incredibly lucrative long-term, but it requires more capital commitment than a standard lease arrangement. We discussed the specifics for 20 minutes, weighing the risks and benefits of a partnership arrangement versus traditional rent payments. The conversation required financial analysis skills that Marcus probably couldn't imagine me possessing, strategic thinking that went far beyond his quarterly sales targets. Tyler, schedule a site visit for next week. If the building has the character and location advantages you've described, the equity participation could be worth the additional complexity. We've always been conservative about expansion partnerships, but the Sacramento market justifies taking calculated risks. After ending the call, I sat in my car contemplating the strange duality of my existence. In the span of 2 hours, I'd commissioned a comprehensive business valuation for my multi-million-dollar restaurant chain and received a condescending text about bringing dessert to a family dinner. The contrast was so absurd it felt like living in 2 completely different realities. The apartment building's hallway smelled like someone's dinner, probably pasta with garlic bread, simple comfort food that reminded me why I'd chosen the restaurant industry in the first place. Food was universal. It brought people together and created shared experiences that transcended economic differences. The irony that my own family couldn't share meals with me without commenting on my supposed financial limitations wasn't lost on me. Inside my apartment, I opened my laptop and began researching dessert recipes, not because I couldn't afford to buy something from a bakery, but because bringing homemade food to family gatherings was part of the persona I'd created. The struggling food blogger would definitely bake her own dessert, probably something simple but delicious that demonstrated her culinary skills without suggesting she had money for expensive ingredients. I settled on a classic apple crisp, made with local Oregon apples and a streusel topping that required basic pantry staples. The recipe was simple enough to prepare quickly, but impressive enough to remind everyone that I did know something about food preparation. It was also the kind of dessert that would complement Patricia's pot roast perfectly, showing consideration for the overall meal composition. The baking process gave me time to think about Sunday's dinner and how to introduce the business valuation report naturally. The document would need to be present but not obviously planted, discovered accidentally rather than presented deliberately. I considered having Tyler call during dinner with questions about the valuation, creating a reason to reference the document without making it seem predetermined. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, and I braced myself for another piece of unwanted financial advice. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation last week and I have a great contact for you. My friend Sarah works in HR at Intel, and she mentioned they're hiring for entry-level positions that don't require technical experience. The benefits are amazing, and it could be a fresh start for you. Want me to make an introduction?" The suggestion was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed out loud. Jessica genuinely believed that an entry-level position at a tech company would improve my financial situation. She had no conception that I employed more people than most Intel departments, that my annual revenue exceeded the budgets of entire corporate divisions. I typed back a polite response about appreciating her thoughtfulness while considering my options, another performance in the ongoing theater of my supposed career struggles. The conversation felt increasingly surreal, like playing a character in a story that had gone on too long and lost coherence. The evening was spent reviewing financial projections for the Sacramento expansion, work that required analyzing market penetration strategies and competitive positioning in a city where I'd never lived but would soon employ dozens of people. The complexity of multi-state business operations made Marcus's regional sales territory seem quaint by comparison, but tomorrow he'd probably offer more career advice based on his assumption that I lacked professional experience. As I prepared for bed, I thought about Rebecca's question regarding my timeline for disclosure. The business valuation report would be ready by Friday, giving me the weekend to plan how to introduce it during Sunday's dinner. The revelation would fundamentally change my relationship with my family, but continuing the charade was becoming emotionally unsustainable. The decision felt simultaneously overdue and premature. Years of hiding had created relationship patterns that wouldn't change easily, but the alternative was continuing to live a lie that served no one's interests. My family would finally understand who Emma Collins really was, and their comfortable assumptions about success and failure were about to be challenged in ways they never anticipated. Sunday dinner was 4 days away, and by the time dessert was served, everything would be different. The struggling food blogger was about to remind her family that appearances can be deceiving, and the most impressive achievements often belong to those who work quietly while others make noise about smaller accomplishments. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Portland feel like the perfect place to build a life, and I spent the morning preparing my apple crisp while Rebecca's business valuation report sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded weapon waiting to be deployed. The document was everything I'd requested, 67 pages of comprehensive financial analysis that painted an undeniable picture of Harvest and Hearth's success and my role as its founder and majority owner. I'd rehearsed various scenarios for introducing the report throughout the week, but none of them felt natural enough to avoid suspicion. The revelation needed to emerge organically from conversation rather than appearing as a predetermined confrontation. As I sliced apples and mixed the streusel topping, I finally settled on a strategy that felt both authentic and strategically effective. Tyler would call during dinner with an urgent question about the Sacramento expansion, specifically regarding investor interest that required immediate attention. I would reluctantly take the call, apologizing for the interruption while referencing the valuation report that potential investors were reviewing. The family's curiosity would do the rest, creating an opportunity for accidental discovery rather than deliberate disclosure. The drive to Patricia's senior community took me through neighborhoods where I'd scouted potential restaurant locations, past buildings that could house future Harvest and Hearth expansions. The irony of heading to a family dinner where I'd pretend to struggle financially while mentally cataloging multi-million-dollar investment opportunities was becoming harder to ignore. Patricia's apartment was warm and filled with the aroma of slow-cooked beef and vegetables, the kind of comfort food that had defined my childhood before restaurant ownership taught me about molecular gastronomy and farm-to-table sourcing. She greeted me with the mixture of affection and concern that had become our standard interaction, immediately commenting on my appearance and asking whether I'd been eating enough. "Emma, sweetheart, you look thin. Are you sure you're taking care of yourself?" Patricia's worry was genuine, rooted in her assumption that financial stress was affecting my health and well-being. "I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding those business courses. I could help with the tuition, and it might open doors to more stable opportunities." Marcus and Jessica arrived 15 minutes later, their matching luxury vehicles parked side by side in the visitor spaces like an advertisement for coordinated success. Marcus carried a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my entire outfit appeared to be worth, while Jessica brought flowers from an upscale florist that I recognized because Harvest and Hearth used their services for special events. "Emma, great to see you," Marcus said with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for distant relatives you tolerate at family gatherings. "How's the food blogging business? Still reviewing food trucks and writing about budget dining?" The question stung not because it was inaccurate but because it revealed how little interest he'd ever shown in understanding what I actually did for work. Marcus had never read my blog, never asked specific questions about my consulting projects, never demonstrated curiosity about the industry expertise that had built my empire. "Business is steady," I replied, setting my apple crisp on Patricia's kitchen counter next to the elaborate flower arrangement. "I've been working on some exciting projects lately, actually consulting for restaurants that are considering expansion into new markets." Jessica perked up at this information, clearly sensing an opportunity to offer more unsolicited career advice. "That's wonderful, Emma. Consulting can be such a great way to build professional relationships. Have you thought about leveraging those connections into a full-time position? Benefits and steady income could really improve your quality of life." The conversation continued along familiar lines as we gathered around Patricia's small dining table, with Marcus describing his latest sales achievements and Jessica sharing updates about luxury home sales in West Hills. Patricia beamed with pride at their accomplishments while expressing subtle concern about my uncertain career trajectory. Dinner was delicious, the kind of home-cooked meal that reminded me why I'd chosen to focus on comfort food rather than trendy fusion concepts. Patricia had learned to cook during an era when hospitality meant abundance, and her pot roast reflected values about food and family that had influenced my approach to restaurant design. Marcus got another commendation from his regional manager, Patricia announced as she served second helpings. They're considering him for the district supervisor position, which would mean overseeing sales teams across 3 states. Marcus accepted the praise with practiced modesty while ensuring everyone understood the significance of his potential promotion. The position would nearly double my current salary and include equity participation in company performance. Jessica and I are looking at houses in the hills that would better reflect our changing status. The timing felt perfect for Tyler's scheduled interruption. My phone rang exactly as planned, and I apologized profusely while explaining that my consulting client had an urgent question about a time-sensitive business matter. The family exchanged knowing looks that suggested they thought my consulting work was probably less important than I was pretending. Tyler, I'm at a family dinner, can this wait until tomorrow? I answered, putting enough frustration in my voice to suggest the interruption was genuinely inconvenient. Tyler played his role perfectly, speaking loudly enough that everyone at the table could hear his side of the conversation. Emma, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Sacramento investors want to move forward with the partnership, and they're requesting additional documentation beyond what's included in the valuation report. They're specifically asking about the executive compensation structure and the timeline for California expansion. I paused dramatically, glancing around the table at my family's increasingly curious expressions. Which valuation report are you referencing? The comprehensive analysis that Rebecca completed last week, or the preliminary assessment from the real estate consultants? The 67-page report that covers the entire harvest and hearth operation, Tyler replied, his voice carrying the kind of professional urgency that suggested significant money was involved. The investors are particularly impressed with the revenue growth projections and the brand recognition metrics, but they want clarification about your role in the expansion timeline. Marcus had stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he processed what he was hearing. Jessica was leaning forward slightly, clearly trying to catch every word of the conversation. Patricia looked confused but interested, sensing that something important was happening without understanding the details. Tyler, I have the report here with me actually. Let me call you back in 20 minutes so I can review the specific sections they're questioning. The executive compensation data is in Appendix C, and the expansion timeline is detailed in Section 4. After ending the call, I apologized again for the interruption while carefully placing my phone next to a manila folder that I'd positioned strategically beside my water glass. The family's curiosity was palpable, but they were too polite to ask direct questions about what they'd overheard. Sorry about that, I said, returning to my pot roast as if multimillion-dollar business negotiations were routine interruptions. One of my consulting clients is considering a major expansion, and the investors get nervous when they can't reach key stakeholders immediately. Marcus cleared his throat, clearly struggling with how to phrase his questions diplomatically. That sounded like a significant project, Emma. What kind of restaurant operation requires a 67-page valuation report? I took a sip of wine before responding, maintaining the casual tone that suggested the conversation wasn't particularly significant to me. It's a regional restaurant chain that's been growing pretty aggressively over the past few years. They started with a single location, and now they're looking at expanding into California. The investors want comprehensive documentation before committing to the expansion funding. How many locations does this chain have? Jessica asked, her real estate background making her naturally curious about commercial property investments. 12 currently, with plans for 15 more over the next 2 years, I replied, cutting another piece of pot roast. It's been interesting work, helping them develop standardized operational procedures and supply chain relationships that can scale across multiple markets. The numbers were clearly making an impression. Marcus was doing mental calculations, probably trying to estimate the kind of revenue that would support 12 restaurant locations. Jessica was nodding with newfound respect for what she was beginning to understand might be more substantial consulting work than she'd previously imagined. What's the name of the restaurant chain? Patricia asked, her motherly curiosity overcoming social conventions about prying into other people's business affairs. Harvest and Hearth, I said, watching their faces carefully as I provided the information they'd need to verify everything I was about to reveal. They specialize in farm-to-table cuisine with locally sourced ingredients. The flagship location is in the Pearl District, and they've been getting fantastic reviews from food critics and customer satisfaction surveys. Marcus's expression shifted as recognition dawned. He'd probably seen Harvest and Hearth mentioned in Portland Business Journal articles about successful local restaurants. Jessica might have shown properties to clients who'd mentioned the difficulty of getting reservations at the Pearl District location. I think I've heard of that place, Marcus said slowly, his tone suggesting he was beginning to suspect that my consulting relationship might be more significant than I'd initially indicated. Don't they have a waiting list for weekend reservations? The brand recognition has definitely exceeded expectations, I replied, maintaining my casual demeanor while preparing for the revelation that would change everything. The owners have been pretty strategic about growth, focusing on quality rather than rapid expansion. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it with obvious concern. Tyler needs me to send him specific pages from the valuation report immediately. The investors are reviewing documentation tonight, and they want clarification about some of the financial projections. I reached for the manila folder beside my plate, opening it to reveal the comprehensive business analysis that Rebecca had prepared. The document was impressive even at first glance, with professional formatting and detailed charts that clearly represented significant analytical work. This is more complex than I expected, I muttered, flipping through pages while searching for the information Tyler allegedly needed. The revenue analysis alone is 20 pages, and the market penetration projections are incredibly detailed. Marcus couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. Emma, can I ask what your role is with this consulting project? The investors seem to be treating you as a primary contact for pretty significant decisions. I looked up from the report with an expression that suggested I was surprised by his interest in what I'd assumed was routine business discussion. Oh, I'm the founder and majority owner of Harvest and Hearth. I thought you knew that. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate as his hand went limp. Jessica's wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth, suspended in midair as she processed what she'd just heard. Patricia blinked rapidly, clearly trying to reconcile my statement with everything she thought she knew about my life. You own Harvest and Hearth? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I started it 5 years ago with a food truck and built it into what it is today, I replied, continuing to flip through the valuation report as if the revelation wasn't particularly dramatic. The expansion into California represents our biggest growth opportunity, but it requires significant capital investment and strategic partnerships. Jessica found her voice first, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Emma, Harvest and Hearth is one of the most successful restaurant chains in the Pacific Northwest. The Pearl District location is booked solid for weeks in advance. The success has been gratifying, I said, finally finding the page Tyler had requested and taking a photo to send him. We've worked hard to create something special, and the customer response has exceeded our most optimistic projections. Marcus was staring at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Emma, if you own 12 restaurants, why are you living in that apartment and driving that old car? Why did you let us think you were struggling financially? The question I'd been anticipating for weeks finally hung in the air between us, and I set down the valuation report to give it the attention it deserved. I've never been struggling financially, Marcus. I chose to live simply because I prefer it, and I never corrected your assumptions because they didn't seem important enough to address. Not important enough? Jessica's voice was rising with indignation. Emma, we've been worried about you for years. Mom loses sleep thinking about your financial security, and you've been sitting on a multi-million-dollar business empire. I turned to Patricia, whose expression showed hurt and confusion in equal measure. Mom, I'm sorry you've been worrying unnecessarily. I should have been more direct about my situation, but I didn't want my success to change how we related to each other as a family. Change how we related. Marcus exploded, finally processing the full implications of what he'd learned. Emma, you've been letting us treat you like a charity case while you're probably worth more than all of us combined. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. I had allowed them to treat me as if I needed their financial advice and career guidance while building something they couldn't have imagined. The deception had served my purposes, but it had also created exactly the kind of relationship dysfunction I'd hoped to avoid. According to this valuation report, I said, opening to the executive summary page, my net worth is approximately $18.7 million, and the business generates about $12 million in annual revenue. So yes, Marcus, your assumption about our relative financial positions has been somewhat inaccurate. The numbers landed like physical blows. Marcus pushed back from the table, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Jessica was staring at the report as if it might suddenly reveal itself as an elaborate hoax. Patricia looked like she might cry, overwhelmed by the revelation that her struggling daughter was actually more successful than she'd ever dared dream. Why would you hide this from us? Patricia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Emma, I've been lying awake at night worrying about your future, making plans to help you if your freelance work dried up. How could you let me suffer like that? The guilt hit harder than Marcus's anger or Jessica's indignation. Patricia's concern had been genuine, rooted in love and maternal instinct rather than condescension or superiority. She'd genuinely suffered because of information I'd withheld, and that consequence hadn't been part of my calculations. Mom, I never intended for you to worry unnecessarily. I thought I was protecting our relationship from the complications that money can create in families. I've seen how wealth changes dynamics between people, and I wanted to preserve what we had. What we had was based on lies, Marcus said, his voice cold and accusatory. Every family dinner, every conversation about careers and success, every piece of advice we've offered you, it was all based on completely false information. He wasn't wrong, and his anger was understandable even if his approach was harsh. Years of playing a role had created relationship patterns based on artificial premises, and the revelation forced everyone to question what they thought they knew about family dynamics and personal success. Marcus, I understand why you're upset, but I need you to consider why I felt the need to hide my success in the first place, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil around the table. Think about how you've treated me based on your assumptions about my financial situation. Think about the condescension, the unsolicited advice, the comments about what I could and couldn't afford. The accusation hung in the air as Marcus processed its implications. His comment about the breadbasket at Bella Vista suddenly took on new meaning, as did years of subtle and not so subtle suggestions about my career choices and lifestyle decisions. You're saying this is our fault? Jessica asked, her defensive tone suggesting she was beginning to understand how her behavior might have contributed to my decision to maintain secrecy. I'm saying that your assumptions about success and failure created an environment where I felt more comfortable hiding my achievements than sharing them. I replied, when someone's worth is constantly measured by visible markers of wealth and traditional career metrics, people who succeed differently learn to stay quiet about their accomplishments. The conversation continued for another hour as we worked through years of accumulated misunderstandings and false assumptions. Marcus struggled with the revelation that his younger sister had achieved more than he'd imagined possible while he'd been offering career advice and financial guidance. Jessica grappled with the realization that her real estate expertise paled in comparison to my commercial property investments. Patricia's reaction was the most complex, combining relief that I was financially secure with hurt that I'd hidden such an important part of my life from her. Her maternal instincts had been focused on solving problems that didn't exist while missing the actual story of my professional development. The evening ended with tentative steps toward rebuilding relationships on more honest foundations. Marcus apologized for his condescending behavior while acknowledging that my success challenged his assumptions about achievement and recognition. Jessica admitted that her financial advice had been presumptuous and inappropriate given her incomplete understanding of my situation. Patricia insisted on seeing photos of the restaurants, marveling at the elegant interiors and professional kitchen operations that her daughter had created from nothing. Her pride was tinged with sadness that she'd missed witnessing the development of something so impressive, but her excitement about future family dinners at Harvest and Hearth locations was genuine and heartwarming. The drive home took me past the Pearl District flagship location where the dinner service was winding down and late-night customers were settling in for dessert and coffee. The restaurant looked different somehow, as if revealing my ownership had made it more real and substantial. The secret empire had stepped out of the shadows, and Emma Collins no longer needed to pretend that success was beyond her reach. 6 months later, I was sitting in the private dining room of our newest Sacramento location, celebrating the California expansion with Tyler and our management team. Marcus and Patricia had driven down for the opening ceremony, where Marcus had given a surprisingly eloquent speech about entrepreneurship and the courage required to build something meaningful from nothing. The revelation had fundamentally changed our family dynamics, but in ways that felt healthier and more authentic than what we'd maintained before. Marcus had developed genuine respect for my business acumen, occasionally asking for advice about his own career decisions. Jessica had become an invaluable resource for commercial real estate acquisitions, her professional expertise finally applied to projects worthy of her skills. Patricia had embraced her role as the proud mother of a successful entrepreneur, sharing stories about harvest and hearth with her bridge club friends and insisting that every family celebration be held at one of our locations. Her worry had been replaced by excitement about future expansion plans and pride in achievements she could finally acknowledge openly. The struggling food blogger had become a successful restaurateur, but more importantly, Emma Collins had learned that authentic relationships require honest communication about who we really are and what we've accomplished. The most impressive achievements often belong to those who work quietly, while others make noise about smaller accomplishments, but eventually success demands to be acknowledged and celebrated with the people who matter most. The weeks following that explosive Sunday dinner unfolded in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, revealing how deeply my secrecy had affected not just my relationships with family, but my own sense of identity and purpose. Marcus had requested a private meeting at a coffee shop downtown, and I arrived expecting continued confrontation but found instead a brother who looked genuinely humbled by the revelations about my life. "Emma, I've been doing a lot of thinking since that dinner," Marcus began, stirring his coffee nervously. "I need to apologize not just for the specific comments I made, but for years of treating you like you needed my guidance when you were building something I could never have imagined creating myself." His vulnerability surprised me more than his anger had. Marcus had built his entire identity around being the successful older brother, the one who'd figured out professional achievement while his sister fumbled through unstable creative work. Learning that narrative was completely inverted had forced him to reconsider not just his assumptions about me, but his understanding of what success actually meant. "The thing that keeps bothering me," Marcus continued, "is that I never once asked you detailed questions about your work. I never showed genuine interest in what you were building or why you were passionate about it. I just assumed that because your path didn't look like mine, it must be less valuable or less successful." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding beginning to lift. "Marcus, I contributed to the problem by hiding the truth. I let you make assumptions because it felt easier than explaining why I chose to live the way I did. We both have responsibility for the dynamic we created." The conversation extended into a longer discussion about achievement and recognition, about how society measures success, and what gets lost when people focus only on visible markers of accomplishment. Marcus admitted that his own career satisfaction had been declining even as his salary increased, that the metrics he'd used to define success were leaving him feeling empty despite checking all the traditional boxes. "Watching you build Harvest and Hearth while I was dismissing your work makes me realize I've been chasing the wrong goals," he said quietly. "You created something meaningful that brings people together and employs hundreds of workers. I've been selling software subscriptions and calling it achievement." The honesty was painful but necessary, clearing space for a different kind of relationship built on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. We made plans for Marcus to visit the Pearl District location during a dinner service, giving him a chance to see the operation I'd built and understand the complexity of restaurant management at scale. Jessica had reached out separately, requesting lunch at a restaurant I didn't own so we could talk without the awkwardness of being on my professional territory. She arrived looking uncomfortable, clearly still processing how dramatically she'd misunderstood my situation. "Emma, I owe you a massive apology," Jessica started before I'd even ordered. "I've spent years offering you financial advice and career guidance when you were actually running circles around both Marcus and me professionally. I feel like an absolute fool." Her embarrassment was genuine, and I could see how the revelation had forced her to reconsider her own accomplishments and expertise. Jessica had built a successful real estate career and took pride in her professional knowledge, but learning that I'd been acquiring commercial properties worth millions while she was offering budgeting tips had fundamentally challenged her self-perception. The worst part is that I was so convinced I was helping you, Jessica continued. Every piece of advice, every suggestion about career changes or financial planning, I genuinely thought I was being supportive. Now I realize I was being insufferably condescending to someone who could have taught me more about business than I'll ever know. We spent the lunch discussing her real estate work in detail, and I was impressed by her knowledge of Portland's commercial property market. The conversation eventually led to a genuine business opportunity when I mentioned the Alberta Arts District expansion plans and the challenges of finding the right property in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Emma, I would love to help with that search, Jessica said, her professional enthusiasm emerging. Not as charity or family obligation, but because commercial restaurant properties are actually my specialty, and I think I could add real value to your site selection process. The offer was genuine and practical, representing a shift from her previous attempts to help me based on assumed need to collaboration based on complementary professional skills. We made plans for her to prepare a market analysis of potential Alberta locations, work that would be compensated at her standard professional rates, because our relationship was finally operating on equal footing. Patricia's adjustment to the revelation was the most emotionally complex, combining relief about my financial security with grief over the years she'd spent worrying about problems that didn't exist. She'd invited me to her apartment for tea, just the two of us, so we could talk without Marcus and Jessica's presence complicating the conversation. Emma, I've been a terrible mother, Patricia said, her eyes filling with tears as she poured tea into delicate china cups. I spent so much time worrying about you that I never actually saw you. I was so focused on what I thought you needed that I completely missed what you'd actually accomplished. The guilt in her voice was heartbreaking because it came from a place of genuine love. Patricia hadn't dismissed my achievements out of malice or superiority, she'd simply been unable to see past her maternal anxiety to recognize that her daughter had exceeded every measure of success she could have hoped for. Mom, you weren't a terrible mother, you were worried because you love me, and because the information you had suggested I was struggling, I replied, sitting beside her and wrapping my arm around her shoulders. I'm the one who should apologize for letting you carry unnecessary anxiety for years. We talked for hours about my journey from food truck to restaurant empire, and Patricia asked detailed questions about every stage of development. She wanted to understand how I'd made strategic decisions, how I'd financed the initial expansion, how I'd built the team that could operate 12 locations simultaneously. Her pride in my accomplishments was evident, but it was mixed with sadness that she'd missed witnessing the development of something so impressive. I wish I could have been there for the important moments, Patricia said quietly. Your first restaurant opening, your first profitable quarter, the day you signed the lease for the Pearl District location. Those were milestone moments in your life, and I missed them because I didn't know they were happening. The regret in her voice highlighted one of the real costs of my secrecy. By hiding my success to avoid changing family dynamics, I'd also excluded my mother from sharing in the joy of my achievements. The protection I'd thought I was providing had actually isolated me from the support and celebration that could have enriched both our lives. Mom, there are plenty of important moments still coming, I assured her. The Sacramento expansion, the potential move into California's bigger markets, maybe eventually expanding beyond the West Coast. You can be part of all of that if you want to be involved. Patricia's face lit up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. Emma, I would love that. I know I don't understand restaurant operations, but I could help with community outreach or local partnerships. I spent my whole banking career building relationships in the business community, and those skills don't just disappear after retirement. The offer was both touching and practical, representing Patricia's desire to contribute meaningfully rather than just observe from the sidelines. We discussed potential roles she could play in future expansion efforts, focusing on her genuine strengths in relationship building and community engagement, rather than trying to force involvement in areas outside her expertise. The following weeks brought more conversations and adjustments as my family learned to relate to me based on accurate information rather than false assumptions. Marcus started asking substantive questions about business strategy and operational challenges, treating me as a peer rather than a younger sister who needed guidance. Jessica began sending commercial property listings that actually matched my expansion criteria, applying her professional skills to genuine business needs. Patricia threw herself into researching the Sacramento market, connecting with business associations and community groups that could provide insights into local dining preferences and competitive dynamics. Her banking background had taught her how to navigate professional networks, and she was discovering that those skills translated well into supporting restaurant expansion efforts. But the most significant change was internal, a shift in how I understood my own relationship to success and recognition. Years of hiding had taught me to separate my achievements from my identity, to view my business empire as something separate from who I was as a person. The revelation had forced me to integrate those aspects of myself, to acknowledge that Emma Collins, the struggling food blogger, and Emma Collins, the successful restaurateur, were the same person viewed from different angles. Tyler had noticed the change during our weekly strategy meetings, commenting that I seemed more confident and decisive in ways that went beyond business planning. "Emma, you're different since you told your family the truth. It's like you're finally allowing yourself to be proud of what we've built together." He was right, though I hadn't fully articulated the transformation even to myself. The weight of maintaining a double life had been heavier than I'd realized, creating a psychological burden that affected how I approached both family relationships and business decisions. Living authentically, even with the complications it created, felt like breathing freely after years of holding my breath. The California expansion became a family project in unexpected ways. Marcus used his tech industry connections to introduce me to potential investors and strategic partners in the Bay Area. Jessica's real estate network extended into Sacramento, and she arranged site visits to properties that matched our criteria perfectly. Patricia joined me for several California trips, using her relationship-building skills to connect with local business associations and community leaders. The Sacramento flagship location opened 6 months after that revelatory Sunday dinner, and the entire family attended the grand opening celebration. Marcus gave a speech about entrepreneurship and family support that managed to be both personal and professionally appropriate. Jessica had helped negotiate the lease terms and building improvements, saving us significant money through her knowledge of commercial real estate contracts. Patricia had established relationships with local food bloggers and media contacts, generating opening night coverage that exceeded our marketing team's expectations. Standing in the crowded restaurant, watching customers enjoy food that existed because of vision and work I'd poured into building something meaningful, I felt a completeness that had been missing during years of secret success. The achievement was finally something I could share with the people who mattered most, even if the path to that sharing had been complicated and painful. The Oregon locations continued thriving while the California expansion exceeded projections. The management team I'd built proved capable of maintaining quality across increasing geographic distance, and the operational systems we'd developed scaled effectively to new markets. Within a year of the Sacramento opening, we'd added 2 more California locations and were seriously evaluating opportunities in the Seattle suburbs. My relationship with Marcus evolved into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and honest communication. He'd begun exploring entrepreneurial opportunities of his own, applying lessons from watching my journey while building on his tech industry expertise. Our conversations shifted from him offering advice to us brainstorming together as equals, each bringing different perspectives to complex business challenges. Jessica became a regular consultant for Harvest and Hearth's real estate decisions, her professional skills finally deployed in ways that created value for both parties. The financial compensation was secondary to the satisfaction she found in contributing meaningfully to something successful and growing. Our relationship transformed from obligatory family connection to professional collaboration built on complementary expertise. Patricia discovered a second career in community relations and local partnership development, skills she'd developed during banking years but never fully utilized during retirement. Her work opening doors in new markets proved invaluable as we expanded beyond our original Pacific Northwest base. The pride she took in contributing to her daughter's business empire replaced the anxiety she'd carried about my supposed financial struggles. The most profound transformation was in how I understood the relationship between authenticity and achievement. Years of hiding had taught me that success without recognition felt hollow, that achievements unshared with people who matter become isolated victories disconnected from meaningful relationships. The revelation had been painful and complicated, but it had created space for genuine connection based on truth rather than comfortable fictions. One evening, nearly a year after that transformative Sunday dinner, I found myself back at Bella Vista with Marcus and Jessica for dinner. The maitre d' recognized me immediately this time, greeting me by name and mentioning how much the staff enjoyed dining at Harvest and Hearth locations on their days off. Marcus smiled watching the interaction, a genuine expression of pride rather than the superior smugness that had characterized his previous demeanor. "Remember when I made that comment about you not being able to afford appetizers here?" Marcus asked as we reviewed menus. "I think about that moment constantly and cringe at how blind I was to everything you'd accomplished." "We both contributed to that blindness," I replied gently. "I chose to hide my success, and you chose not to look too carefully at assumptions that supported your preferred narrative. But we've moved past that now." Jessica raised her wineglass in a toast to Emma, who taught us that success comes in many forms, and that the most impressive achievements often belong to people working quietly while others make noise about smaller accomplishments. The toast was borrowed from a line I'd written in my blog months earlier, but hearing Jessica quote it with genuine appreciation rather than condescension felt like a closing of circles. We ordered appetizers freely, laughed about the absurdity of that earlier dinner, and made plans for our next family gathering at the newest Harvest and Hearth location in Eugene. The struggling food blogger had finally become the successful restaurateur in her family's eyes, but more importantly, Emma Collins had learned that authenticity requires courage, and that genuine relationships depend on honest communication about who we really are. The double life had served its purpose for a time, protecting me from judgment, and allowing me to build something meaningful without the weight of family expectations. But living fully meant integrating all aspects of identity, claiming achievements openly, and allowing people who matter to share in both the struggles and the triumphs of building something from nothing. The revelation had been painful and complicated, challenging comfortable assumptions and forcing difficult conversations. Yet it had also created space for relationships built on truth rather than convenient fictions, professional respect rather than assumed hierarchy, and mutual support rather than one-directional charity. The empire I'd built in secret had finally stepped into the light, and Emma Collins no longer needed to choose between her professional success and her family relationships. The restaurants continued thriving, the expansion plans continued developing, and the future stretched ahead filled with possibilities that could finally be shared with the people who'd shaped my life even when they didn't understand my choices. Success without recognition had taught me the value of internal validation and the importance of building something meaningful regardless of external acknowledgement. But success shared with people who matter taught me that achievement gains depth and significance when it becomes part of larger relationships rather than isolated accomplishment. The balance between privacy and sharing, between protection and vulnerability, between careful secrets and open truth, remains complicated and context-dependent. But standing in my own restaurant empire surrounded by family who finally understood what I'd built and why it mattered, I knew that the revelation had been worth the risk, and that authentic relationships require the courage to be fully seen, even when being seen means challenging comfortable assumptions and forcing difficult growth. The transformation in family dynamics brought unexpected challenges that nobody had anticipated during those initial conversations about honesty and authenticity. 3 months after the revelation, I received a phone call from Marcus that immediately set off alarm bells based purely on his tone. He needed to meet urgently, and his voice carried the kind of stress that suggested something had gone seriously wrong in his professional life. We met at a quiet bar in Northwest Portland, far enough from both our usual haunts that we were unlikely to encounter people we knew. Marcus looked exhausted, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain with a wrinkled shirt and 2 days of stubble. He ordered a whiskey neat before even greeting me properly, which told me everything I needed to know about the severity of whatever situation he was facing. Emma, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to promise you'll hear me out before reacting, Marcus began, his hands wrapped around his glass like it was the only solid thing in his universe. My company is going through restructuring, and the regional manager position I was so proud of is being eliminated. They're offering me a demotion back to my previous role with a 30% salary cut, or a severance package that would cover 6 months of expenses. The information hit me hard, not because of the professional setback itself, but because of what it revealed about the financial house of cards Marcus and Jessica had been maintaining. Their lifestyle had been calibrated to his inflated salary, and a 30% reduction would devastate their carefully constructed image of success. Marcus, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Corporate restructuring is brutal, and it's rarely about individual performance, I said carefully, sensing that there was more coming, and wanting to create space for him to explain the full situation. He finished half his whiskey before continuing. The thing is, Jessica and I have been living beyond our means for the past 2 years. The house in West Hills has a mortgage that requires both our incomes at current levels, and we've been using credit to maintain a lifestyle that impresses our social circle. Between the car payments, the travel, the country club membership, we have maybe 2 months of expenses in actual savings. The admission must have cost him enormously, revealing financial fragility to the sister he'd spent years treating as financially incompetent. But I could see the desperation in his eyes, the recognition that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford when his family's financial security was genuinely threatened. We need to sell the house and downsize immediately, but the market is soft right now, and we'd take a significant loss, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Jessica is mortified because all her real estate colleagues will see our listing and understand exactly what it means. Her entire professional image is built on success and upward mobility. I waited, knowing that there was an ask coming, but wanting him to articulate it clearly, rather than dancing around what he actually needed. The dynamic between us had shifted so dramatically that I needed him to approach this as an adult requesting help, rather than an entitled older brother expecting his struggling sister to bail him out. Emma, I need to borrow money to bridge the gap while we restructure our lives, Marcus finally said, forcing himself to meet my eyes. Not a gift, a legitimate loan, with a formal repayment schedule and interest. I need about $50,000 to cover mortgage payments while we sell the house and pay off the most pressing credit card balances. The amount was significant but not catastrophic given my financial position. What concerned me more was whether lending Marcus money would recreate the same toxic dynamic that had characterized our relationship before, just with the power positions reversed. The last thing I wanted was to become the family bank that enabled continued poor financial decisions. Marcus, I need to understand something before we discuss any potential loan, I said carefully. Are you asking me for money to fundamentally restructure your financial life, or are you asking me to help you maintain a lifestyle that's unsustainable, regardless of your employment situation? His face flushed with embarrassment, but he held my gaze. Honest answer, I'm asking you to help us get out of a hole we dug ourselves, while we were too proud to admit we were drowning. Jessica and I have had brutal conversations this week about how we've been living, and we both recognize that even without the job situation, we were heading toward financial disaster. The honesty was what I needed to hear, evidence that he understood the deeper problems, rather than viewing this as a temporary cash flow issue. We spent the next hour discussing his actual financial situation in detail, reviewing mortgage documents and credit card statements that painted a picture of systematic overspending driven by social pressure and status anxiety. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm sitting here asking my sister for financial help after years of making comments about her inability to afford things, Marcus said, his voice heavy with shame. You were building actual wealth, while I was building a facade of success, using debt and credit. I was so focused on looking successful that I never bothered to actually become successful. I pulled out my phone and opened a note-taking app, beginning to outline terms for a potential loan that would address his immediate crisis while forcing genuine financial restructuring. The amount would be $50,000 as he'd requested, but with conditions that protected both of us from falling into unhealthy patterns. Marcus, I'm willing to lend you the money, but with specific terms that will formalize through an attorney, I began, watching his face carefully for any signs of resistance to the structure I was proposing. The loan will be at a market interest rate, with monthly payments beginning in 6 months to give you time to stabilize after the transition. The repayment schedule will be based on your reduced salary, not your previous income. His relief was palpable, but I held up my hand to indicate I wasn't finished outlining conditions. Additionally, you and Jessica need to work with a legitimate financial advisor to create a sustainable budget and debt reduction plan. Not as a condition of the loan, but because I'm not going to watch you dig another hole after I help you out of this one. Marcus nodded emphatically, accepting the conditions without negotiation. Emma, whatever terms you set are fine. I'm grateful you're even considering this after how I've treated you. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. The next week involved meetings with attorneys to formalize the loan agreement, creating documentation that protected both parties and established clear expectations for repayment. The process felt coldly transactional for a family relationship, but the formality was necessary to avoid the kind of ambiguity that creates resentment and conflict. Jessica had initially resisted the idea of involving me in their financial crisis, her pride still struggling with the role reversal that put her in the position of needing help from someone she'd patronized for years. But when Marcus explained the alternative was losing their home and potentially declaring bankruptcy, she'd accepted the assistance with as much grace as she could muster. Patricia learned about the situation when Marcus asked her to witness the loan documents, and her reaction revealed how completely the family dynamic had shifted. Instead of being horrified that her successful son needed financial rescue from his supposedly struggling daughter, she was simply grateful that I was in a position to help and willing to do so. Emma, I'm proud of you for helping your brother while also maintaining appropriate boundaries, Patricia said during a private conversation after the document signing. You're not just rescuing him from a crisis, you're teaching him lessons about real financial stability that he clearly needed to learn. The loan transferred on a Friday afternoon, and Marcus called me that evening to confirm receipt and express gratitude that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. Emma, this loan bought us breathing room to make better choices, but more importantly, it gave me a reality check about the difference between appearing successful and actually being successful. Thank you for being willing to help, despite having every reason to enjoy watching me face consequences. The situation with Marcus was still unfolding when a different family complication emerged, this time involving Patricia and her senior community living situation. She'd been living in a modest but comfortable apartment in Beaverton, but the community had announced significant rent increases that would strain her fixed-income retirement budget. Patricia had initially tried to handle the situation herself, cutting other expenses and adjusting her lifestyle to accommodate the increased housing costs. But after several months of struggling silently, she'd finally admitted to me during a casual dinner that she was worried about her financial sustainability in the community she'd grown to love. "Mom, why didn't you mention this sooner?" I asked, immediately calculating the annual cost difference and realizing it was easily within my capacity to address. "How much is the rent increase and what's the impact on your monthly budget?" Patricia's discomfort was obvious as she explained the numbers. The increase was substantial enough to eliminate most of her discretionary spending, forcing her to choose between staying in her community or maintaining the social activities and small luxuries that gave her retirement meaning and purpose. "I didn't want to burden you after everything that's happened with Marcus," Patricia explained, her voice tight with emotion. "You've already done so much for this family, and I felt like asking for help would just be piling on." The psychology behind her hesitation was fascinating and sad in equal measure. Before learning about my financial success, Patricia would have asked for help without a second thought, assuming that was what families did for each other. But now that she understood my actual financial position, she was reluctant to request assistance because she didn't want to appear to be taking advantage of my wealth. Mom, I'm going to cover the rent increase, I said firmly, cutting through her protests before they could fully form. Not as a loan but as a gift, because you raised me and supported me, and ensuring your comfortable retirement is both my responsibility and my privilege. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head stubbornly. Emma, I don't want your money. I'm capable of adjusting my lifestyle to fit my income. I just needed to express my frustration about the situation, not ask you to solve it for me. The conversation revealed the complexity of family financial relationships when resources are unevenly distributed. Patricia's pride and independence were important to her, but they were also preventing her from accepting help that would meaningfully improve her quality of life. The balance between respecting her autonomy and ensuring her well-being required navigation skills that nobody had taught me. Mom, let me propose something different, I suggested, thinking through alternatives that might be more acceptable to her sense of independence. What if instead of me covering your rent increase, you come work for Harvest and Hearth part-time doing community outreach and local partnership development? You've already proven you're excellent at that work during the Sacramento expansion. The position would come with compensation that covers your rent increase and gives you meaningful work that you enjoy. Her face transformed as she considered the proposal, pride and relief competing for dominance. The idea of earning the money, rather than receiving it as charity, appealed to her sense of independence while still solving the financial problem that threatened her comfortable retirement. Emma, I would love that, Patricia said, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. Not just for the money, but because I've discovered that retirement is boring when you're not contributing to something meaningful. The work I did in Sacramento was the most engaged I've felt in years. We formalized the arrangement through the same attorney who'd handled Marcus's loan documents, creating an employment contract that established Patricia as a part-time consultant for community relations and partnership development. The compensation was set at market rates for her experience and skills, respecting her work rather than inflating pay as disguised financial assistance. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on any of us. The family member who'd been most worried about my financial security was now working for me, while the brother who'd offered endless career advice was receiving a loan to avoid financial catastrophe. The reversal of roles was so complete that it occasionally felt like we were living in an alternate reality. Tyler had observed the family dynamics evolving and commented during one of our strategy meetings that he'd never seen someone navigate sudden wealth and family relationships with as much thoughtfulness. Emma, most people in your position either completely cut off their family or let themselves be taken advantage of financially. You've managed to find a middle path that maintains relationships while setting healthy boundaries. His observation highlighted something I'd been learning through trial and error over the months since the revelation. Money changed family relationships whether you wanted it to or not, but the specific changes depended on how both parties chose to navigate the new reality. Marcus's loan request could have become a source of resentment and power imbalance, but the formal structure and genuine repayment plan had prevented that outcome. Patricia's employment could have felt like charity disguised as work, but her genuine contributions to the business and market rate compensation maintained her dignity and independence. The key seemed to be acknowledging the changed circumstances openly while creating structures that respected everyone's autonomy and worth beyond their financial position. Jessica had the most complex adjustment of all the family members, her professional pride deeply wounded by needing help from someone she'd patronized about career decisions. She'd thrown herself into the real estate consulting work for Harvest and Hearth with an intensity that suggested she was trying to prove her value and expertise to herself as much as to me. Emma, I need to apologize again for every piece of unsolicited career advice I ever gave you, Jessica said during a site visit to a potential Eugene location. I was so convinced that my conventional career success made me qualified to advise you, when you were actually building something I could never have imagined creating. The apology was sincere, but it was also the fourth or fifth time she'd apologized for the same behavior. At some point, the repeated apologies became less about seeking forgiveness and more about processing her own discomfort with how wrong she'd been about fundamental aspects of my life and capabilities. Jessica, I appreciate the apology, but I need you to stop punishing yourself for assumptions that were reasonable based on the information you had, I said gently. I deliberately hid my success from you so your conclusions were logical even if they were incorrect. What matters now is how we move forward. She nodded, but I could see the struggle continuing behind her eyes. Jessica's identity had been built around her professional competence and success, and discovering that she'd been completely wrong about someone close to her challenged her self-perception in uncomfortable ways. The months following these various family financial complications brought unexpected growth for everyone involved. Marcus threw himself into his reduced responsibility position at work with renewed focus, no longer chasing promotions and status but actually engaging with the work itself. He and Jessica had downsized to a modest house in a less prestigious neighborhood, and the relief of living within their means was visible in both their demeanors. The funny thing about not trying to impress anyone anymore is that I'm actually happier, Marcus told me over coffee one morning. The house in West Hills was beautiful, but it was also a prison. Every month was stress about making the mortgage payment and maintaining appearances. Now we live in a normal house in a normal neighborhood, and I sleep better than I have in years. Patricia had embraced her role with Harvest and Hearth enthusiastically, developing relationships with community organizations in every market we were considering for expansion. Her work was legitimately valuable, opening doors that would have remained closed without her particular combination of professional experience and grandmother-like approachability. Emma, I'm making more money now than I ever did during my banking career, Patricia mentioned during one of our planning sessions. And I'm having more fun too. Retirement was supposed to be relaxing, but it turns out I'm happier when I'm building something meaningful. Jessica had stopped apologizing constantly and instead channeled her energy into becoming the best possible real estate consultant she could be for our expansion efforts. Her competitive nature, once expressed through status competition, now manifested as determination to find properties that exceeded every expectation and close deals that saved significant money. The family dynamics had fundamentally restructured themselves around more authentic relationships based on actual circumstances rather than comfortable assumptions. The process had been painful and complicated, forcing everyone to confront ways they'd contributed to unhealthy patterns. But the result was a family that actually knew each other and functioned based on truth rather than convenient fictions. Standing in the newest Harvest and Hearth location in Bend, Oregon, watching my family work together to prepare for the grand opening, I felt a completeness that had been missing during all the years of secret success. Marcus was helping set up tables with genuine enthusiasm rather than condescension. Patricia was greeting community leaders she'd connected with during her outreach work. Jessica was coordinating with the local press about coverage of the opening. The struggling food blogger had become not just a successful restaurateur but a family leader who'd learned to navigate wealth and relationships with integrity and thoughtfulness. The journey had been more complicated than I'd ever imagined when I first started hiding my success, but the destination was worth every difficult conversation and uncomfortable revelation. The empire I'd built in secret had stepped fully into the light, and Emma Collins had learned that authentic relationships require not just honesty about circumstances, but also ongoing negotiation of how those circumstances affect family dynamics. Success without recognition had taught me independence, but success shared with people who mattered taught me that achievement gains meaning through connection rather than isolation. The year following all the revelations and restructured family relationships brought growth that extended far beyond business metrics and revenue projections. I found myself sitting in a conference room in San Francisco, preparing to pitch Harvest and Hearth to a group of venture capital investors who could fund an aggressive expansion into major metropolitan markets across California. Tyler sat beside me, reviewing the presentation materials one final time before the investors arrived. Emma, I have to ask you something that's been on my mind, Tyler said, setting down his tablet and turning to face me directly. Are you sure you want to bring in outside investors? We've built this company maintaining complete control over every decision, and venture capital means giving up some of that autonomy. The question was valid and touched on concerns I'd been wrestling with privately for months. Harvest and Hearth had grown from nothing to a regional success story through careful reinvestment of profits and strategic borrowing for expansion. Bringing in institutional investors would accelerate growth dramatically but would also introduce external pressures and expectations that could change the company's character. I've been thinking about legacy, I replied, surprising myself with the honesty of the admission. We've built something special, but staying regional means we're vulnerable to larger chains that could copy our model and deploy it nationally with more resources. If we're going to protect what we've created, we need the capital to scale before someone else does it for us. Tyler nodded thoughtfully, understanding the strategic logic, even if he shared my concerns about maintaining the company's soul during rapid expansion. The pitch went exceptionally well, with investors responding enthusiastically to both our financial track record and our plans for preserving quality during growth. By the end of the meeting, we had preliminary term sheets from 3 different firms offering funding that would enable opening 20 new locations over the next 18 months. The flight back to Portland gave me time to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. The modest food truck operation I'd started 5 years earlier was about to become a nationally recognized brand with locations in major markets from Seattle to San Diego. The transformation felt both exhilarating and terrifying, success on a scale that required me to evolve beyond the hands-on operator who'd built the initial locations. Marcus had been following the expansion discussions with genuine interest, occasionally offering insights from his tech industry experience about scaling operations while maintaining culture. Our relationship had settled into something resembling actual friendship, built on mutual respect rather than the competitive dynamic that had defined our earlier interactions. Emma, I've been thinking about your investor conversations and I want to share something I learned the hard way at my company, Marcus said during one of our now regular coffee meetings. When you bring in outside money, you're not just getting capital, you're getting partners who have their own ideas about how to run the business. Make sure your deal terms protect your ability to maintain the vision that made Harvest and Hearth special in the first place. The advice was solid and came from someone who'd watched his own company compromise its values chasing growth targets set by investors. Marcus's professional setback had given him perspective about the difference between sustainable success and unsustainable expansion, lessons he was generous enough to share, despite the role reversal that made him the advisor rather than the advisee. Jessica had become invaluable during the site selection process for the California expansion, her real estate expertise and growing network of commercial brokers enabling us to secure prime locations in competitive markets. She'd fully embraced her role as a professional consultant rather than a family member, offering charity help, and her confidence had returned as she demonstrated genuine value beyond our family connection. Emma, I found an incredible opportunity in Santa Monica, Jessica said during a video call, her excitement palpable even through the screen. It's a corner location with ocean views and foot traffic that's off the charts. The landlord is motivated to close quickly because of personal financial issues, which means we might be able to negotiate favorable terms. Her professional enthusiasm reminded me why she'd been successful in real estate before personal insecurities had undermined her confidence. Jessica was genuinely talented at identifying properties with potential and negotiating deals that created value for her clients. The family drama had obscured that talent temporarily, but she'd rediscovered her professional footing through legitimate work rather than status competition. Patricia had exceeded every expectation in her community relations role, developing partnerships with local farms and suppliers that both strengthened our farm-to-table authenticity and created positive community relationships in every market we entered. Her work had become so valuable that I'd increased her role and compensation, not as family generosity, but as recognition of genuine business contribution. Emma, the farmers in the Willamette Valley are talking about Harvest and Hearth as a model for restaurant-farm partnerships. Patricia told me proudly during a planning session. Several other restaurant groups have reached out asking how we structure our supplier relationships. I think there might be an opportunity to formalize our approach and share it more broadly. Her suggestion was insightful and aligned with growing industry interest in sustainable sourcing and local agriculture partnerships. We began developing materials that documented our farm partnerships and supply chain practices, creating content that positioned Harvest and Hearth as a thought leader in sustainable restaurant operations. Patricia took the lead on this project, her banking background providing skills and documentation and process development that translated well to creating industry resources. The venture capital deal closed 3 months after that initial San Francisco pitch, bringing in $12 million in growth capital that would fund the most aggressive expansion in company history. The celebration dinner was held at the Pearl District flagship location, with the entire family present along with key employees and investors. Standing to offer a toast, I looked around the table at faces that represented different chapters of my journey. 5 years ago, I was operating a food truck and dreaming about what might be possible if I could create something meaningful in the restaurant industry. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. Tonight, we're celebrating funding that will take Harvest and Hearth national, but more importantly, we're celebrating the people who've supported this vision, even when they didn't fully understand it. Marcus raised his glass with genuine pride, no longer competing but celebrating. Jessica smiled, with confidence that came from knowing her contributions were valued and necessary. Patricia beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd found purpose in unexpected places during retirement. Tyler nodded with the quiet pride of a partner who'd been there since the beginning and understood the magnitude of what we'd built together. The expansion unfolded rapidly over the following year, with new locations opening in San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle's suburbs. Each opening brought challenges related to maintaining quality and culture while growing at an unprecedented pace. The lessons I'd learned about delegation and trust were tested constantly as I worked to build management systems that could preserve what made Harvest and Hearth special while operating across multiple states. David Kim, the marketing executive I'd started dating during the previous year, had become an unexpected source of support and perspective during the intense expansion period. Unlike my family, he'd known about my business success from the beginning of our relationship, which meant our dynamic was built on accurate information rather than evolving assumptions. "Emma, you're spread incredibly thin right now," David observed one evening as we reviewed expansion timelines over dinner at my apartment. "Have you considered that the pace you're maintaining might not be sustainable long-term? Building a national brand is a marathon, not a sprint." His concern was rooted in genuine care rather than criticism, and I appreciated having someone in my life who could offer perspective without the complicated history that colored family interactions. David understood the restaurant industry through his marketing work with hospitality clients, which meant his feedback came from informed expertise rather than generic relationship advice. "I know I'm pushing hard right now, but this expansion window won't stay open forever," I replied, feeling the exhaustion I'd been ignoring for months. "If we don't establish ourselves in these markets quickly, someone else will copy our model and beat us to it." David nodded, but pressed his point gently. "I understand the strategic urgency, but I also see you running yourself ragged in ways that aren't sustainable. What happens to Harvest and Hearth if you burn out trying to expand faster than your systems can support?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. The empire I'd built through careful planning and sustainable growth was now expanding at a pace that required different skills and different approaches. The hands-on operator who'd perfected recipes and trained staff personally couldn't be present in 20 locations simultaneously. Delegation and systems were necessary, but they also meant accepting less direct control over quality and culture. Tyler had been advocating for bringing in experienced restaurant executives who'd managed multi-location operations before, but I'd resisted hiring people whose loyalty was to their careers rather than to the vision that had driven Harvest and Hearth's creation. The expansion funding made that resistance increasingly impractical, forcing me to choose between maintaining personal control and enabling sustainable growth. Emma, I want to introduce you to someone who could help with the scaling challenges we're facing, Tyler said during a strategy meeting a few weeks later. Her name is Michelle Torres, and she spent 15 years managing operations for a national casual dining chain before they were acquired. She understands how to maintain quality across distributed locations while building systems that preserve company culture. Michelle came highly recommended with references from executives at companies I respected, but meeting her triggered all my insecurities about losing control of what I'd built. She was polished and professional, with PowerPoint presentations about operational excellence and quality management systems that felt corporate in ways that made me uncomfortable. Emma, I understand your concerns about maintaining the Harvest and Hearth culture during expansion, Michelle said during her second interview, addressing the elephant in the room directly. I've watched companies lose their soul chasing growth, and I've also watched companies fail because they couldn't scale their founder's vision effectively. The key is building systems that codify what makes you special so it can be replicated without losing authenticity. Her understanding of the balance I was trying to achieve convinced me to take the risk, and Michelle joined Harvest and Hearth as Chief Operating Officer with responsibility for developing scalable systems and processes. Her first months were tense as she pushed for documentation and standardization that felt constraining to my freewheeling entrepreneurial approach. But gradually, I began to see how her systems actually preserved quality more effectively than my personal oversight ever could. These training manuals you've developed are incredible, I told Michelle during a review of her first quarter's work. They capture not just what we do, but why we do it, which means new employees can understand the philosophy behind our operational decisions. Michelle smiled with satisfaction that came from someone who'd found the right fit after years of corporate positions that never quite aligned with her values. Emma, what makes Harvest and Hearth special isn't just the food or the atmosphere, it's the intentionality behind every decision. My job is to make sure that intentionality can scale beyond your personal presence. The family had adjusted to the increased pace of expansion with varying degrees of success. Marcus had successfully completed his loan repayment ahead of schedule, rebuilding his financial foundation with the discipline he'd learned from watching how sustainable success actually worked. He'd declined a promotion opportunity that would have required relocating, choosing instead to prioritize stability and family connection over career advancement. I spent so many years chasing titles and salary increases that I forgot to ask whether I was building a life I actually wanted to live, Marcus told me during a celebration dinner marking his final loan payment. Watching you build Harvest and Hearth taught me that success means creating something meaningful, not just climbing a ladder someone else designed. Jessica had expanded her consulting work beyond Harvest and Hearth to include other restaurant clients seeking commercial properties, leveraging her expertise and network to build a specialized practice. Her confidence had fully returned, no longer dependent on status competition, but rooted in genuine professional accomplishment. Patricia had become a minor celebrity in Portland's sustainable agriculture community, her work connecting restaurants with local farms, earning recognition from industry publications and community organizations. She'd started speaking at conferences about supply chain partnerships, sharing lessons from Harvest and Hearth's approach with audiences eager to learn from our model. Standing in the Santa Monica location during its grand opening celebration, watching families enjoy meals in a space that hadn't existed a year earlier, I felt the full weight of what had been built through vision, work, and the messy complexity of family relationships.
The struggling food blogger had become a nationally recognized restaurateur, but more importantly, Emma Collins had learned that success, without authentic connection, remains hollow, no matter how impressive the external achievements. The journey from secret empire to public success had required confronting uncomfortable truths about family dynamics, wealth disparity, and the difference between appearing successful and actually building something meaningful. The pain of revelation had been necessary to create space for genuine relationships based on truth rather than comfortable assumptions. Success shared with people who mattered, with all its complications and challenges, was infinitely more meaningful than isolated achievement hidden behind careful facades. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.